Thank you very much, Abhishek. Thank you to Mia, who's now outside, for helping me to put this event together. Thank you very much to all of our sponsors and to all of you for being here. Like has already been said, it's now, our last event here was January 2020, so we're delighted to be back again. When we put the agenda together for the initiative, the event which was supposed to be in January, the whole thing was environment actually, but obviously, as you know, something else cropped up 6-7 weeks ago, a couple of thousand miles east of here, and we can't have a proper agenda without mentioning those issues as well. So I would like to invite to the stage Philippe Doba-Pantanace, a geopolitical strategist in the Economic Research Division of Standard Chartered, and Philippe is going to give us a presentation on navigating new unknowns, macroeconomic and geopolitical trends amid uncertain times. Philippe, please.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Mia. Thank you, Abhishek. I don't have props, you know, it's an economic presentation, and I won't show you a PowerPoint either, because today I will simply tell you the story of how one of the most formidable economic recoveries in recent history was crushed by a series of events that are still unfolding today. My name is Philippe Doba-Pantanace, and I'm a senior economist and global geopolitical strategist at Standard Chartered Bank Research. First, I want to say how delighted I am to be here today and finally have a chance to discuss this topic with an audience that is at the very heart of the subject matter. And, you know, after hearing me talk about International Assembly, 17 countries being here, I'm also probably relieved that, you know, you're probably going to be more tolerant of my thick French accent. Anyway, back to our story. 2022 was supposed to be the year of global economic recovery post-pandemic. And that gained momentum, you know, globally. And we were on track to that. Some GDP growth figures at the end of 2021 were either record or unseen. You had India growing at 13%, Ireland growing next door, growing at 13%, and India at 10%, which was a multi-year high. Here in the UK and France, growth in 2021 was close to 7%. Same thing, multi-decade high. And the US typically grew 6%. Then, in the space of a few weeks, some cracks or headwinds that actually some of them were there, and that's important to note, got suddenly wide open. And they were abruptly compounded, obviously, by the start of the war in Ukraine. And now, you know, at the end of the first quarter of this year, multiple indicators have turned red. Global deal making is down 23% from a year before. As you all know, global food prices are at an all-time high. US consumer confidence, which you probably know, has a huge, it's a crucial forward indicator, as we call them, of future growth. US consumer confidence abruptly collapsed in March to its lowest level in over a decade. Global export PMI, so you know PMI is Purchasing Manager Index, dropped to its lowest level since the height of the COVID pandemic in 2020. Two-thirds of the countries surveyed reported a contraction in manufacturing exports. And global trade just in the month of March fell 3% from February, Obviously, that was mostly driven by a sharp drop in container ship traffic from the two countries at war. But actually, when you look at the details, every single region showed a contraction in March. So today we will look briefly at what is going on in a world where economics is increasingly shaped by geopolitics vagaries. And we will look at two main aspects of today's evolution. The first is how could the economic recovery stumble and stall so abruptly? And then how the latest geopolitical development is entrenching pre-existing trends that are reshaping globalization as we have known it for the past 30 years. And don't worry, I'm not going to speak here until cocktail time. Huh? This is going to be very short. It's really food for thought. So first, how could the economic recovery stumble and stall so fast? Especially, when you could look at the figures at the end of 2021, and generally, the way it works in economics is that if you have an end of the year that is really strong, it actually gives you a leg to the following year. And as I was saying, GDP growth figures were actually unseen in decades for many parts of the world, even if there already you could say that there were some catch-up effect at play. Basically, here is to say that 2020, for obvious reasons, was so bad that generally, the year after, it's sort of a through boom type of cycle. So you can put that into context. But even if you look at unemployment rates, they are at record lows. The EU, as a political construct, has never seen an unemployment so low since the beginning of the EU. Even if, again, here there are more some fundamental and long-term explanations at play. And obviously, what we witness is that there was a general pent-up demand, in various consumer goods, such as, big-ticket items, cars, services, think holidays. And all of this was being unleashed, as the world was opening up again. And many households had accumulated massive savings during the pandemic. Actually, it was almost an issue. The level of savings in mostly developed countries, people were wondering where this would go. And in fact, some of the inflationary pressures that started to build before the war started in Ukraine were the classic signs of overheating economies, with demand outpacing supply. But as I said, there were some cracks that were already there pre-conflict, but the expectation was that they could be papered over with time. And now the key question where we sit today is that we're not so sure anymore that we're going to be able to overcome these headwinds. So first, let's look at the residual, what we call, the residual economic scarring, typical economic jargon, from the pandemic. And they were still very high, again, even before the war started in Ukraine. And that is the case typically of the supply chain problems that have had repercussion in almost all sectors. And obviously, crucially, on inflation. The consequences of the never-ending pandemic, people sometimes in some conversation tend to forget it. They're still very there. With China's typically zero COVID policy approach, there's still massive impact. As we speak, Shanghai and several parts of China is in complete lockdown. And the China index that expresses supplier delivery time estimates already dropped to its worst since the early phase of the pandemic. And that has nothing to do with the war in Ukraine. And then there was obviously the lingering concerns of, after years of whatever it takes translated by fiscal expansion for most countries that wrote checks, left and right, time of frugality and fiscal moderation was in the mind of everyone. And that's something that is not necessarily an issue when your economy is booming. But with the economic picture changing, how much government can do to alleviate these headwinds is really a key question. And inflation in particular has been deeply problematic. Even before the war, food prices had been rising around the world, driven by the higher shipping cost. And I know we could get into so many layers of explanation into that. Energy inflation and labor shortages, typically something else, that have followed in the pandemic's wake. Extreme weather played a role too, on crops, on maritime circulation in certain straits. And because all of the inflationary pressures that were building amid this sort of mini boom, and the reason just mentioned, policymakers, and here, again, jargon, policymakers, you want to think central bankers. Central bankers started to wonder about the nature of this inflation. Was it transitory? Do you remember that whole debate, are we going through a transitory time of inflation? Or was it more structural? And it's a key debate, actually. It's not only for academics, because depending on what answer a central banker has on is inflation structural or transitory, the response will be different. Because an inflation that is actually, an external shock that is transitory, you can raise interest rate as much as you want. It won't do anything. And so you're killing, yourself with no effect. And the perception at the time was that it was mostly transitory, actually, due to an external shock, as I mentioned, the pandemic and its consequences, and temporary bottlenecks in the economy. And typically one was, bottlenecks in supply chain and train, and in container shipping. Some were saying, it just takes time to readjust, post-pandemic, but we're gonna get there. But as time passed, inflation became worse and worse. And now inflation in developed market is at a 30-year high. And it started to look like inflation expectation, which is something slightly different, it's looking at the future, were becoming embedded, entrenched, and as we say, anchored. And the problem, if you're a central banker and you start to feel like inflation expectation become anchored, is that it becomes self-fulfilling. There's inflation, people expect inflation, actually inflation will come. Won't get into too much detail into that, but it's a classic, things of economic literature. And central banks started to realize that they had no choice but to change course and start a fairly aggressive tightening cycle, rising interest rates. And it started, with the Fed raising interest rate for the first time since 2018. Bank of England did the same. The ECB indicated that they would follow suit. And as you know, the immediate effect of interest rate rise is to constrain growth. And so here you go, you had that added headwind, and this one is definitely not over. And the war started right after that. And everything that was there, or sometimes not even there, came back with vengeance. The issue with inflation became the #1 policy issue for all governments, with food prices at all-time high, as mentioned, but obviously also energy prices, soft commodity prices, except that now the options for governments are not infinite. After years of fiscal largesse, the room of maneuver is very tight, if not inexistent, actually, for some of the weaker countries. And it's actually a huge problem for emerging markets, typically. You also have this thing where at a certain level of price, and that's something that is classically observed on commodity prices, oil typically, at a certain level of price, when they get too high, demand starts to fall. And that's what we call, consumer, they change their habits, they push back purchasing decisions. This is called demand destruction. And of course, demand destruction is one of the worst piece of news, that you can have for growth. And the consequence of all of that is that in a matter of few weeks after the conflict started, most analysts revised downward their global growth forecast. And we at SCB Research just had to revise our global GDP growth forecast, and we had to shave off more than 1 percentage point of global growth, and now see growth just shy of 3.5% globally for this year, with downside risk to this. At this level, to give you an idea, because maybe 3.5% of global growth doesn't tell you anything, we're still okay. We're okay. But think that the more we get close to 2% in terms of global growth, then the more the world at large gets closer to recessionary territory. And here, I'm not trying to fool you with saying 2 is close to 0. It's just that, technically, you say that a country is in recession when, contractory territory, negative. Actually, it's different for the world. The world, we estimate that at 2% growth, we're in recession, essentially. It won't go into the details, but just one thing to give you here is just to say that not every countries are born equal. When you grow 2-3% in a developed market, you're great. If you're India or China, if you grow 2 or 3%, you're really in trouble, because you are at a different level of emerging. And so, there's some estimate that say, for example, under 4 to 5%, India cannot lift the minimum numbers of people out of poverty. So there's a minimum level that you need to have. So that's why at the global level, when the world grows at 2%, we're in recession. And so now, obviously, the picture is the prospect of the 70s. Remember, it's in everybody's mind. Inflation, low growth prospect, stagflation. So that's, the sort of nightmare word that everybody has in mind in our little circles of economists. And that is the economic picture that we are facing as we speak today, and whether that assessment changes back to improve will be highly dependent on the fate of the conflict and in the way it poses material constraints to growth, but also, and probably more importantly, seriously, is how it will influence confidence of both investors and consumers. Because actually the channel of transmission of this conflict, one way or another, is through confidence. When confidence drops, consumer drops, and for countries like developed countries, the US, let me give you the US, 2/3 of the US growth comes from consumption. Consumption is linked to confidence. Now, if we turn to the second aspect of this brief presentation, let's look at one critical characteristic of how economics and geopolitics interact. And I want to talk about the increasing politicization of supply chains and how it is affecting global trade. The first thing to say is that it's been a while, actually, that companies and government have been looking at their supply chain risk. But this took really, if you remember, a sudden urgency when the tensions between the US and China came to the surface under the Trump administration. Remember, if you think about trade barriers, tariff, if you're an American company with massive plants and installation in China, you have to think about that. How does that, affect your supply chain? Then came the pandemic, and then came the war in Ukraine. And the pandemic, typically, reignited nationalist instinct by highlighting countries' dependencies on faraway supply chain. Remember, all the talks about medical equipments and gears, medicines. This also led to a reassessment of what constitutes strategic sectors. The list of products deemed key to national security have expanded, pushing a rethink of multiple complex and fragmented supply chains. The focus and assessment and on the concentration risk in global supply chain is also pushing toward a simplification and a shortening of the supply chain maps. Typically, we are seeing some geographical shift that translate into a more regional approach to supply chain. And for many developed markets, it also means choosing producing countries geographically closer to their consumer market and choosing producing countries that are deemed more ideologically aligned. Make no mistake, supply chain politics is nothing entirely new, but its ramifications have been increasingly exposed in recent years. As we said, the pandemic still continues to disrupt supply chain. Geopolitical tensions between the West and China haven't gone away, and certain countries' massive exposure to Ukraine and Russia in terms of commodity typically is really pushing a rethink. And that means for many countries or companies the need to shorten the flow of goods, diversify sources of their services, components, raw material, but also the need to bring production home becomes more acute. In one word, nearshoring, remember offshoring, nearshoring is increasingly seen as an economic and political imperative. I can conclude by giving you one example. 1 in 5 members of the American Chambers of Commerce in Shanghai, so essentially all the American companies that are in China, which is still the world's factory, by the way, 1 in 5, when surveyed, said that in 2021 they redirected investment away from China. Of these, 35 chose Mexico, 35%. Globalization is not over, but it's certainly changing. Thank you very much for your attention. Let me wish you a good day and conference.